you've got to look at the underlying circumstances and the way they change from the beginning of the Climate Change Convention, which I suppose is the late 1980s, through to about 2005, and that's the period in which the EU really was a leader. It was able to be a leader because it had a lot of presence, what I would define as presence, that is to say it was a big emitter, second only to the United States. I think it was responsible for 19% of global carbon dioxide emissions. The US was 25%. That's changed, of course, now. It's down to about 14%, and China's much, much more significant. So it's not as a significant a player economically and in terms of emissions as it was at the beginning of the period. I think one of the other key things is that the structure of international climate politics has changed. That is to say, the EU was able to be a leader partly because the United States had abdicated that role. I mean, the United States virtually invented, California virtually invented modern environmental policy and was very much a leader right up until the time of I think the famous Montreal Protocol on the protection of the stratospheric ozone layer. And then everything changed. The United States withdrew, and into the vacuum, if you like, came the European Union that was able to take the lead on a whole range of environmental treaties, but also other things like International Criminal Court and so on and so forth, and was able to burnish its identity as an actor by doing so. Now, when you get to Copenhagen, this has changed. The United States has re-engaged under Obama, and of course, countries that were not centrally concerned because they weren't required to make commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, like China and India, are now centrally drawn into the debate, the so-called basic countries. And so I think the opportunity structure for the European Union changed significantly. The infighting's always been there, and one of the more remarkable things about the European Union in climate politics is it's been able to take a lead because of the differences between the member states and its complex internal procedures, and the fact that, of course, climate policy is conducted under shared competence. That is to say, neither the community has competence, the right to lead, nor the member states. They share it, and that leads to manifold complications. So this is an ongoing thing with the European Union, and it's got worse, of course, with 27 member states. It was difficult enough when you had, say, 15 member states, but you could imagine the problems of trying to get agreement, going around the table, when you have to cope with potentially 27 different opinions. In fact, it doesn't actually work like that. You know, that some, depending on the issue, the countries are more or less involved, but it's still very difficult. And one of the things that they are trying to accomplish under the Lisbon Treaty is to make the EU's external representation much more coherent through building an external action service. And one of the things you can discuss is how far the external action service will take on board climate politics and try to reinforce the EU's role as a leader. By domestic policy, I think you mean the policy within the internal market as opposed to the specific national policies. Now, yes, I mean that it's increasingly important is domestic policy in external climate policy, simply because when they started before Kyoto, they didn't have to do much in terms of changing the internal policies of the Union, because they could see that for some very particular reasons they will be able to hit their emissions targets. That is to say, Germany was able to incorporate East Germany, and by closing down a lot of East German industry was able to have a major reduction in emissions, and the British were also able to contribute because of the so-called dash for gas, the closing down of the UK coal industry. And if you put all that together, it meant that you had a credible negotiating position at Kyoto. Now, of course, this didn't work. It hasn't worked after 2005, and we've had to take real measures in terms of first the emissions trading system and then the climate and energy package, which are difficult and contested to support our external climate policy. Now, they managed to do that in the 2008 climate and energy package, although that still hasn't been fully implemented yet. So there's been a much stronger link recently between external climate policy and internal climate and energy policy. And the other thing you mentioned was, of course, the euro crisis, the general economic crisis of the European Union, which is very worrying because that, potentially, if we go into a really significant economic downturn, it will, amongst other things, affect our credibility and our ability to play a role in global politics, generally in climate politics in particular. And in the shorter term, the preoccupation with firefighting and with dealing with the Euro crisis tends to push other things off the policy agenda, which ought to be continuously at the top of the policy agenda, and one of them I would suggest is climate and energy security.
Well, Poland is seen as the bad guy in climate change policy in Europe because Poland basically has a problem because 95% of its energy production is fueled by coal, and coal is a major emitter of CO2. Add to that, the Polish society is quite conservative on an issue like this. Attitudes are very much rooted in the past. People don't believe that this is a real problem. And the government is worried that if it brings in the things that the EU wants it to do and that climate change negotiations would demand, then Polish industry, but mainly the power industry, will be harmed. And the power industry in Poland is a very, very strong lobby. The barriers to Poland being more constructive on climate change policy are basically a fear that this will bring an enormous cost to the Polish economy. And Poland sees itself as a country which is still developing. It still has to catch up with Western Europe. Incomes are still lower than they are in Western Europe. And they feel that this is an additional cost, an additional burden. And also the major problem is that the politicians and the leaders of the country don't believe that this is an issue at all. They are actually climate change deniers, apart from the environment industry and people who know about these things and professors and so on. And there are climate change campaigners. But for the media and for the politicians, this is really a non-issue, which is an irritant coming from the European Union. The European Union is telling them what to do. They have to do it because they are a member state, but they will try and minimize the costs. A good example is the energy efficiency certificates for building. The building minister said, we have to do this because the EU is telling us to do this, but we're going to do this so a minimum cost to the industry, to the building industry. Really the most effective thing would be to dangle some money in front of for the Polish economy, EU money, and that basically would mean that you would have to translate EU climate funds, investment of EU climate funds into the Polish economy by turning them into regional funds. The simplest way would be for regional fund spending to be translated into climate change spending for the next budget period. That way Poland could get money for its development, but will be developing towards a low carbon economy. Poland will be holding the presidency of the EU in the second half of 2011, and that could do harm to EU climate change policies if Poland doesn't get interested in this whole issue more than it has up till now. On the other hand, the presidency at the moment isn't that important because there is an EU president in the form of Mr. Rompuy. Also, it'll only be 4 months, so maybe it will be marginal, but it's something that has to be taken into account, especially as Poland will be coming after Hungary, and Hungary is another climate change denier.